Hello, welcome to Phantom Homicide, David Parker Ray, the Toy Box Killer. We are launching a deep dive today into a case that really almost defies conventional true crime investigation. We're focusing entirely on David Parker Ray. He's known chillingly as the Toy Box Killer. And the paradox, the thing that really defines this case is this. Ray was proven, convicted, sentenced for being a serial rapist and torturer. I mean, an architect of horrific, prolonged sexual violence. Yet, despite being suspected of murdering up to 60 people, 0 homicides were ever confirmed. Not one definitively tied to him.
And that paradox, that's really the core of what we need to unpack today. When you look at the forensic material, the documented criminal history of Ray, you're not just looking at a criminal, you're looking at a man who quite deliberately created a system of depravity designed specifically to eliminate evidence, witnesses, and crucially, memory itself. So our mission here is to try and understand the calculated mind that spent, an estimated $100,000 designing and outfitting this dedicated chamber of horror.
$100,000. It's staggering.
It is. And how he managed to maintain this terrifyingly normal facade for decades, right there in the heart of New Mexico.
It's that meticulous nature of the evil that's just so unsettling. You know, this wasn't chaos. This was like a well-funded, engineered operation.
Exactly.
And he operated in plain sight in a resort community, truth or consequences.
And that right there speaks volumes about the level of compartmentalization Ray achieved. I mean, he's almost a textbook example of calculated, premeditated evil. He had the stability, right? A civil service job. He had the social ease to go to local bars, find people. And yet his private existence was singularly devoted to systematic, organized violence. Understanding that huge gap between the public man and the private monster. That's where we have to start. We need to look at his disturbing foundation.
Okay, so let's go back. David Parker Ray was born November 6, 1939, Belen, New Mexico. And what's fascinating, or maybe telling about his early years, is this instant psychological conflict you see in his family structure. He often lived with his maternal grandparents, Russell and Dolly Parker, apparently because his family was in, poor financial condition. And the sources describe them as strict disciplinarians.
Right, and that kind of strict environment, it often breeds deep repression, doesn't it? But what really complicated Ray's situation was the counter-influence of his biological father, Cecil Leland Ray. His father was an alcoholic mechanic, and crucially, he was the person who apparently fed young David's nascent violent fantasies. He'd sporadically supply him with magazines depicting sadomasochistic pornography.
Wow, so you've got this clash. On one hand, the repressive discipline trying to enforce normalcy, and on the other, this systematic introduction of, sexualized violence from his own father.
Exactly.
That's got to create a kind of cognitive disconnect, right? It almost allows the darkness to develop completely in secret.
Yeah, it really does. The fantasies weren't just internal. They were being actively fed, kind of normalized and internalized from a young age. And we see the first real sign of this dark life solidifying when he's around 14. His sister, Peggy Pearl Ray, she actually discovered his drawings. Sadomasochistic drawings, pornographic pictures related to bondage practices.
And finding that must have just shattered their relationship.
Well, it did, completely. And the estrangement that followed that discovery is really significant, I think.
How so?
Well, it teaches him immediately, doesn't it? This inner life must be completely hidden. It solidified the secrecy, the need for it, and it probably reinforced that high-functioning compartmentalization that would define his entire adult life.
He was documenting this stuff, drawing these violent scenarios from such a young age.
And it seems it wasn't just fantasy for very long. The sources chronicle this horrifying claim Ray apparently made to his first wife. He told her he committed his first homicide around 1957.
1957. So he would have been, 17 or 18?
Exactly. Just a teenager. He specifically claimed he kidnapped a woman, tied her to a tree, brutally tortured her, and then rendered her.
That is just chilling. Such an early indication of a pattern.
Yeah.
Now, the authorities, they were never able to verify that specific account.
No, they couldn't verify it. But the fact that he stated it, that he included it as part of his history, it suggests a criminal career potentially spanning over 4 decades.
Right. It confirms this long-term commitment to violence wasn't something that just appeared later in life.
Not at all. And yet, despite this escalating history or claimed history, he completely perfected the mask of sanity. He served honorably in the U.S. Army.
As a mechanic, right?
Yes, a general mechanic, which gave him technical skills he would later put to, profoundly disturbing use. And then for decades, he was employed as a maintenance man for the New Mexico Parks Department.
And working for the Parks Department in Truth or Consequences. That gave him more than just a paycheck. It gave him legitimacy.
Yeah.
Right? Familiarity with remote areas near Elephant Butte Lake,
Huh?
which of course became his hidden graveyard. Truth or Consequences. It's a small resort town only 5 miles from the lake. And Ray was known to frequent the local bars there.
He was presenting himself as just an ordinary, stable working man, and that kind of cover, it's absolutely essential for any long-term serial criminal. He used those bars as a hunting ground.
Scouting vulnerable victims.
Yes. In a somewhat transient environment where people come and go, makes their eventual disappearance less likely to raise immediate red flags.
And if there was ever any doubt about how long and how seriously he was committed to this lifestyle, well, we have his own words. The sources reference this advisory tape he made in 1993. On it, Ray chillingly gives his own statement of intent. He says, quote, "I've been raping bitches ever since I was old enough to jerk off and tie little girls' hands behind their back."
That quote, which he would actually later play to his victims. It's just the perfect, horrifying summation of his life, isn't it?
It really is.
It confirms the sheer length of criminal activity stretching right from his teenage years up to his arrest. It leaves absolutely no room for any defense that this was, a sudden snap or some momentary madness. This was a sustained, calculated, and lifelong commitment to sadism. And it was fully realized in the structure he built for it.
The toy box.
Okay, the toy box. The audacity of it is what really sets this case apart from almost any other serial sadist I can think of. This wasn't some, makeshift space in a basement. It was purpose-built, high-tech almost. Tell us about the physical space itself.
Well, it was a repurposed cargo trailer, white, about 14 by 24 feet, parked pretty discreetly behind his property near Elephant Butte. But the key feature, the one that just tells you everything you need to know about the premeditation involved.
The soundproofing.
Exactly. It was completely soundproofed. We're talking layers of insulation, specific construction techniques designed purely to absorb sound, to contain everything within those walls. A casual criminal, they operate with urgency, maybe stealth. Ray operated with engineering and investment. That's soundproofing alone.
Yeah.
It's psychological torture even before anything happens.
It is. It tells the victim, before a single word is spoken, that the outside world cannot hear them, that their fate is entirely sealed inside that box.
And the level of commitment, it's quantified by the cost. You mentioned it earlier, an estimated $100,000.
That's the figure, yes. Spent over several years equipping this trailer. That is a massive investment, purely dedicated to maintaining this hidden world of pain.
So where did the money go? What did he build in there?
It went into creating this clinical, organized, and utterly dehumanizing environment. The centerpiece really was the torture station itself, a gynecological examination table.
Oh, God.
Yeah, equipped with elaborate restraint systems.
The choice of a gynecological table, that's just symbolically horrific, isn't it?
It truly is. It transforms an instrument usually associated with medical examination, maybe vulnerability, even care, into the central torture station. It sort of institutionalizes the violence. It reduces the victim from a person to just a specimen on a bench.
It removes all elements of human interaction, replaces it with the clinical process.
Precisely. And Ray ensured the psychological torture matched the physical. He mounted mirrors directly into the ceiling right above the table.
Why the mirrors? What was the purpose there?
It seems Ray needed the victim to register the full scope of their own helplessness. The mirrors forced them to witness everything being done to them. Their degradation, their pain, their powerlessness.
Like a calculated attempt at self-annihilation through witnessing.
Yes. It wasn't enough for him just to inflict the pain. The victim had to consciously watch their own suffering unfold.
Okay, so beyond the central table, the sources detail this whole catalog of specialized restraint devices. What else was in there?
Well, we hear about a fur-lined coffin.
A coffin?
Yeah, a makeshift pillory. Elaborate locks, pulleys, various wooden contraptions designed specifically to immobilize and bend victims into excruciating positions.
So a whole arsenal.
Definitely demonstrates planning and variety. He had whips, chains, straps, clamps, leg spreader bars, sort of standard bondage gear, if you can call it that. But then you move into the highly specialized and frankly terrifying equipment. Surgical blades, saws.
Surgical blades.
Suggest?
Extreme violence. Dismemberment, potentially.
Yeah.
He also had syringes and detailed handwritten diagrams. These diagrams showed specific ways of inflicting maximized pain, like instructions.
And the technological elements. Those are perhaps the most unsettling. Electric shock machines, a homemade generator.
Yes, the generator built by Ray the mechanic, right?
Hmm.
That's a clear example of how he integrated his professional skills directly into his sadism.
It wasn't impulsive. He was applying engineering principles to the systematic infliction of pain.
Every single element of that toy box, from the soundproofing right down to the electric generator, it just screams premeditation, careful long-term planning. And we absolutely cannot, we can't bypass the deeply shocking detail that sometimes, while the victims were immobilized, helpless, Ray invited his male dog to rape them.
Yes, that detail. It just speaks to the total and absolute dehumanization he was striving for.
Or even his male friends, the sources say.
Right. It was about stripping the victim of all worth, all agency, confirming that they were nothing more than an object available to anyone or anything he chose. And this practice, it was apparently shared not just by Ray, but by his close associates. It confirms this chilling, shared reality within his inner circle.
Looking at the toy box, it's just so clear this is a sustained, organized pattern of crime.
Right.
Ray's criminal career, potentially starting in the late 50s, right up to his arrest in 1999. The frequency, the duration of captivity, it's astounding.
He was incredibly systematic. The pattern suggests he would kidnap about 4 or 5 women per year.
4 or 5 a year.
That seems to be the estimate. And the typical length of captivity for each victim was around 2 to 3 months.
2 to 3 months. Think about the logistics of that.
Yeah.
Maintaining a prisoner, let alone multiple prisoners over a year, for months at a time.
It requires constant vigilance, resources, planning, and most importantly, a guarantee that the victims wouldn't talk once they were released.
And that guarantee, that was the heart of his strategy, wasn't it? His psychological weapon. When victims would first regain consciousness inside the toy box, they'd hear his orientation tape.
Ah, yes, the tape. This was really the masterstroke of his psychological annihilation strategy. It wasn't a recording of him talking live. It was a methodical, clinical recording, pre-recorded. It detailed exactly what would happen to them. He explained resistance was futile because of the soundproofing. He often suggests they'd already been held for days, even if it hadn't been that long, to immediately induce disorientation and confusion.
Setting the stage, laying out the rules of their subjugation from the very beginning.
Exactly. But if the tape was the psychological setup, the heavy drugs were the closing curtain. And this is the most critical tactic for his long evasion of justice. The use of hypnotic drugs immediately before release.
Specifically, a combination of sodium pentothal and phenobarbital.
Yes, let's focus on those drugs because the choice is extremely deliberate. Sodium pentothal. Well, it's widely known as a hypnotic agent, right? Often associated with truth serum in popular culture.
Right.
By administering this, along with phenobarbital, which is a barbiturate used to reduce anxiety and induce sedation, Ray was likely accomplishing 2 things simultaneously. First, he made the victims incredibly susceptible to hypnotic suggestion.
Meaning they'd follow his final commands during release, like where to go, what not to do.
Potentially, yes, easier to manage the release process, but the second and far more terrifying purpose was the intended amnesia.
Right, to make them forget.
Precisely. These drugs were intended to chemically induce a blank spot, to create complete amnesia regarding the entire ordeal. Ray's goal was explicit, and we have it in his own words from that tape. By the time I get through brainwashing you, you're not going to remember a fucking thing about this little adventure.
He wasn't just committing the crime, he was systematically trying to erase the witness's memory of the crime.
He was literally trying to wipe the slate clean. He would then severely drug them, drive them out, and just abandon them by the side of some country road.
So think about that outcome. A victim wakes up, maybe hours later, maybe days, drugged, confused, potentially injured, physically and psychologically traumatized.
And unable to recall the location, the face of their captor, or any of the crucial details needed to report the crime effectively. This brilliant, chilling chemical strategy. It's the primary reason David Parker Ray likely operated undetected for something like 40 years.
He ensured the witness was functionally useless to law enforcement before they even had a chance to speak. Okay, so Ray wasn't just this meticulous engineer of horror working alone. He was also a master manipulator who cultivated a network of accomplices. Which kind of makes sense, right?
Right.
To maintain the scale of this operation, he probably needed help.
Absolutely. And his primary partner in crime was Cindy Hendy. Apparently, he met her at a state park when she was actually on the run herself, fleeing grand theft and drug charges.
So vulnerable herself.
Potentially, yes. And she quickly became entangled. The sources say they bonded over shared, violent sexual fantasies. She became completely complicit.
How involved was she?
deeply. She helped kidnap women. She actively participated in the torture and sexual abuse inside the toy box. Ray was apparently so confident in her involvement that he even told captives they would be forced to sexually service Hendy as part of the ritual.
Good. Her involvement, though, it was crucial not just in the crimes, but in the eventual conviction, wasn't it?
Yes, very much so. She eventually testified against Ray. She received a 36-year sentence, though she served about 20 years of that and was released back in 2019. Without her testimony, the full picture of what went on inside the toy box might never have been realized legally.
And you have the really tragic, complicated figure of his own daughter, Glenda Jean Jessie Ray.
Yes, her story is difficult. She was both an accomplice and, years earlier, apparently an attempted whistleblower, which just highlights the extreme psychological control Ray must have exerted.
She tried to warn the FBI about her father. When was this?
As early as 1986. There's an account from an agent, Doug Belden, who recalled her specific claims back then. She alleged that David Parker Ray was abducting women, torturing them, and even selling them to buyers in Mexico.
Selling them? That's horrifying. So what happened? Why wasn't he stopped in 86?
Well, this is a huge, critical, systemic failure looking back. The FBI at the time apparently deemed those allegations too vague. Not enough concrete evidence to initiate a full arrest or investigation.
Just think about that. Think about the dozens of potential victims between 1986 and his capture in 1999 who might have been saved if those initial desperate warnings had been acted upon more strongly.
It's a deeply troubling thought. And despite trying to expose him, Jessie ultimately fell back into full complicity. She actively participated in his operations later on, including luring victims like Kelly Garrett.
So she went from trying to stop him to helping him.
It seems so. She eventually pled no contest and received a much lighter sentence, about 30 months in prison plus probation. The fact that she was, at one point, trying to expose him while later simultaneously helping him, it's just the most grotesque proof of Ray's manipulative power, even over his own family.
And finally, there was Dennis Roy Yancey, an acquaintance of Jessie's.
Yes, he became one of Ray's so-called playmates, and crucially, a murder accomplice. Yancey's involvement moves the case from a strongly suspected homicide to confirmed lethality, at least in one instance.
He confessed to a murder.
He did. The 1997 murder of Sylvia Marie Parker. She was only 22. Yancey pleaded guilty, stating he strangled her under Ray's explicit orders after she had been subjected to extensive torture in the toy box.
So Ray ordered the killing.
According to Yancey's confession, yes. Yancey received a 30-year sentence. But what's really important to note here is the difficulty prosecutors faced even with this confession. Neither Ray nor Jessie were ultimately charged in Parker's murder.
Why not? If Yancey confessed, Ray ordered it.
It highlights the meticulous cover-up, likely. Yancey later led police to where he, Ray, and Jessie supposedly disposed of the body, but the remains were gone.
Ray moved them later.
That's the strong suggestion, that Ray returned, probably alone, and moved the body, methodically ensuring that even if an accomplice confessed, the definitive physical proof, the body itself, would be withheld from justice. He controlled the narrative even after the fact.
Okay, so this whole horrifying system, this network, it only came crashing down because of one crucial failure in Ray's nearly flawless protocol, didn't it? The escape of Cynthia Vigil.
Absolutely. Her escape in March 1999 was the pivotal event. Vigil was abducted by both Ray and Cindy Hendy. After 3 days of captivity, she saw an opportunity when Ray was out, likely at work. She found keys Hendy had carelessly left nearby, maybe on a table. She managed to unlock some of her chains, and what followed was just a desperate, violent fight for her life against Hendy.
What happened in the fight?
Sources say she broke a lamp over Hendy's head. And then, in a truly primal act of self-defense, she stabbed Hendy in the neck with an ice pick.
Wow. And then she ran.
She ran, and the visual image of her escape is just unforgettable. Vigil fled the trailer, running down the road wearing nothing but an iron slave collar and padlocked chains.
Oh my God. Just picturing that.
It's horrifying. She was found by a nearby homeowner who immediately called the police. Her incredible courage, her desperate flight, that led authorities directly to the soundproof trailer. It triggered the search warrants, the investigation, and the eventual capture of Ray and his entire network.
Her bravery basically blew the lid off the whole thing. And after Ray's arrest, other confirmed survivors started to come forward, right? Anchoring the reality of the toy box.
Yes, Angelica Montano. She was lured by Cindy Hendy back in 1996. The pretext was completely innocuous, picking up a cake mix. She was subsequently taken to the trailer and tortured. She was eventually released on the highway, apparently after convincing her captors to let her go.
But her story also reveals another systemic failure, doesn't it?
It really does. When she was released and found, she was actually picked up by an off-duty law enforcement officer, and she bravely told him what had happened. She detailed the ordeal.
And he didn't believe her.
Apparently not. The sources say he didn't believe her terrifying claims and simply dropped her off at a bus stop. There was no follow-up investigation, no report filed, nothing. Until Ray was arrested 3 years later.
It just shows how Ray could survive, partly because the system sometimes discounted vulnerable witnesses.
Tragically, yes. Then there's Kelly Garrett. She was lured by Jessie Ray, the daughter, from a saloon, also in 1996. She endured 2 days of torture, and then Ray himself drove her home. Told her husband he'd found her just incoherent on a beach.
Found her? He drove her home after torturing her for 2 days. The audacity.
What's unbelievable? And because of the effects of the amnesia drugs, the confusion, she didn't immediately contact police. Her husband apparently didn't believe her confusing story either, and it led to their divorce.
So the drugs worked. Essentially, she couldn't articulate what happened.
It seems they were horrifyingly effective. Garrett was only eventually identified years later. Among the evidence found at Ray's property was a 1996 videotape. Investigators were able to identify her from that footage, specifically via a distinctive tattoo on her ankle.
So she couldn't even identify herself as a victim until the police found literal video evidence of her torture years later.
Exactly. It confirms the chilling efficacy of his amnesia strategy.
Okay, so these survivors, they provide the concrete reality. But then we have to confront this staggering ghost count. The belief, the suspicion that Ray raped, tortured, and ultimately killed up to 60 individuals.
Yeah, and that high estimate, it isn't supported by bodies found in or around the toy box itself. It's supported by the evidence of his disposal methods, the testimony of accomplices like Hendy and Yancey, and his own journals.
Right, like Billy Ray Bowers, where he's former mechanic employee in Phoenix.
Exactly. Bowers disappeared in 1988. A year later, his body was discovered wrapped in a blue tarp in Elephant Butte Lake, shot in the back of the head. Cindy Hendy specifically stated that Ray had told her he killed Bowers and disposed of him in the river or the lake.
And the journals themselves. They suggested even more victims, right? Like Jill Suzanne Troya.
Yes. She was last seen with Jessie Ray in 1995 after an argument at a restaurant. Ray's meticulous journal apparently described the torture of an Asian woman matching Troya's exact description. It supports the idea that his records detailed the acts, the torture, even if they deliberately omitted the burial sites.
And there was another one mentioned, Connie.
Right. An 18-year-old woman, European descent, long blonde hair. According to Ray's journal, she was abducted and murdered in December 1995. The evidence related to her case included a 2-page letter from an Australian man named Mark.
Did they ever find him or identify Connie?
No. Despite joint investigations by the FBI and the Australian Federal Police, they couldn't locate Mark. And Connie remains a missing person. Her remains have never been found.
Which brings us to the ultimate horror, the Lake of Secrets. Elephant Butte Lake. What was found there?
Well, the sources confirm the recovery of this 80-pound gunny sack, found by a fisherman. Inside was confirmed to be dismembered human flesh. Critically, it lacked organs or bones, suggesting a specific type of mutilation.
And there's that alleged statement from Ray detailing how to fill the chest cavity with cement weights before disposal.
Exactly, to ensure it sinks and stays hidden. The systematic nature of the disposal is key. Later, I think it was 2011, bone fragments belonging to an unidentified female leg were also found in the lake.
So even though 100 FBI agents searched his property and the surrounding land extensively, finding no intact, identifiable human remains.
Right. The highly fragmented, weighted, and mutilated remains recovered sporadically from the lake strongly corroborate the claims about his disposal methods. They were designed for permanent concealment.
He knew exactly what he was doing. He kept this highly detailed diary, recording every action against his victims, describing the torture, the psychology, but intentionally left out one key detail.
Where he buried the bodies.
Exactly. That omission was his ultimate legal defense against murder charges.
And recognizing this huge gap and desperately seeking closure for potential families, the FBI took that really unusual step in 2011, years after his death. They released hundreds of images of jewelry and clothing collected from the property.
Hoping someone would recognize an item connected to a missing person.
Yes. But still, the vast majority of the true scope of his crimes, the identities of potentially dozens of victims, remains unrecovered, unknown.
So the sheer lack of identifiable human remains, That created immediate problems in the courtroom, didn't it? Even with the mountain of evidence found inside the toy box itself.
It made the prosecution's job immensely difficult. A judge actually ruled that the cases for the three confirmed survivors, Vigil, Montano, and Garrett, had to be tried separately.
Separately, why would that be a problem?
Well, the prosecution argued fiercely against it. They felt it damaged their ability to paint the full, comprehensive picture for the jury. They couldn't use the clear pattern of abuse, the corroborating testimony of the women together, to demonstrate Ray's habitual criminal intent across cases.
Right. Showing it wasn't just isolated incidents, but a system.
Exactly. And even more cripplingly, much of the toy box evidence itself, including that chilling audio orientation tape where Ray describes his sadistic lifestyle, was ruled inadmissible in 2 of the 3 cases.
You're kidding. The tape was inadmissible. The most damning evidence of premeditation and his own mindset.
Inadmissible in 2 trials. Think about that. The jury couldn't hear his own words describing his decades of abuse in those specific cases.
So how did the defense handle that?
Ray's defense strategy capitalized entirely on this evidentiary confusion and the lack of bodies. Their argument was insidious and, for a time, chillingly effective. They claimed the sex trailer, the toy box, was merely part of Ray's elaborate fantasy life.
Fantasy life.
Yes, and that any sexual activity that occurred there was consensual role play.
Consensual. The $100,000 torture chamber, the weapons, the restraints,
Yeah.
that was just a prop for consensual kink.
That was the argument, and it temporarily worked. It actually convinced a jury, leading to a mistrial in the first Kelly Garrett trial.
A mistrial, based on that defense. That just highlights Ray's power, doesn't it? His ability to almost gaslight society itself, to make people believe this meticulous, horrifying system was just harmless fun.
It was a temporary victory for him, though. After the successful retrial, where he was convicted on all 12 counts against Kelly Garrett, Ray seemed to see the writing on the wall. He agreed to a plea bargain during the Cynthia Vigil trial in 2001.
Okay, why the plea deal then? What changed?
The primary motivation behind that plea deal seems deeply selfish, but very much focused on his control over his family. Ray apparently wanted to obtain leniency for his daughter, Jessie. That was his main goal.
So he traded his own admission of guilt for a better outcome for her.
It appears so. He pleaded guilty to numerous offenses related to the abduction and sexual torture of the 3 young women, Vigil, Montano, and Garrett.
On a sentence.
Astronomical. 224 years in prison, which effectively secured a life sentence. It guaranteed he would never walk free. But the deal prevented the long, grueling, and potentially unsuccessful process of attempting to try him for every single suspected homicide based on circumstantial evidence. It was a compromise for certainty.
And then came the final act. The most complete act of evasion, really, securing his secrets forever.
His death. Ray died of a massive heart attack on May 28, 2002. He was 62 years old, incarcerated at the Lee County Correctional Facility.
And the timing of his death. That's the truly tragic consequence here, isn't it?
It is the most tragic consequence for the potential victims' families. Ray died just before a planned interrogation by state police. He had reportedly, finally, agreed to show authorities where he buried his victims.
He agreed to show them, after all that time.
That's what the reports suggest. An agreement was in place, which would have provided answers, finally, to the families of those suspected 60 missing women. By dying when he did, he took the true scope of his crimes, the locations of potentially dozens of bodies, to the grave with him, forever.
The truth was utterly, irrevocably denied. #tag conclusion and legacy. So when we try to synthesize David Parker Ray's profile, what are we left with criminologically?
Well, clinically, you're looking at an extreme pathology. You see the classic traits of sexual sadism disorder, the necessity of inflicting pain for sexual gratification, and clearly high-functioning psychopathy. That allowed him to maintain that extraordinary public facade while dedicating, hundreds of thousands of dollars and decades of his life to this hidden chamber of horrors.
In this pathology, it was enabled by specific sociological contexts, wasn't it?
Absolutely. He deliberately targeted vulnerable populations, women dealing with substance abuse issues, perhaps involved in sex work, populations whose disappearances, tragically, are often less noticed or less thoroughly investigated by society and sometimes law enforcement.
Combine that with the geographic isolation of a place like Truth or Consequences.
It created the perfect storm, the perfect environment for his long-term success in remaining undetected.
The legacy, though. It's not just about the horror, is it? There's also this profound thread of resilience. Cynthia Vigil, the survivor who literally escaped wearing an iron collar.
Her story is incredible. She, along with another advocate named Christine Barber, founded Street Safe New Mexico, It's a volunteer harm reduction nonprofit.
What do they do?
They work specifically with vulnerable people on the street, trying to prevent the kind of systemic failures, the overlooking of victims that allowed someone like Ray to operate for so long. It's an incredible proactive measure born directly from unimaginable trauma.
That's amazing. But no, the sheer volume of Ray's suspected victims and that methodology he used, active since the late 1950s, potentially. It leaves us with this final, really haunting question, doesn't it?
It does. We know his goal was to use those amnesia-inducing hypnotic drugs, sodium pentothal, phenobarbital, to literally erase the memory of the ordeal.
So if he was successful, even partially successful, kidnapping maybe 4 or 5 women a year for possibly 4 decades, and chemically wiping their minds afterwards, what does that mean for the true count of his victims?
It means the horror isn't just the 60 suspected deaths, though that's horrifying enough. It's the potential, the possibility, that there are scores of survivors still alive today, living functional lives maybe across the country, maybe even the world, completely unaware.
Unaware of the horrifying 2 or 3 months they might have spent inside the toy box?
Exactly. David Parker Ray didn't just torture their bodies. He aimed to permanently erase their identities as victims, erase their trauma, erase their ability to seek justice or even understand what happened to them. And that secret, the secret of the erased memory, that's the final horrific act of control that he managed to protect until his very last breath, and maybe forever.
Okay, so we hope you liked our today's discussion. For more such discussions, subscribe to our channel, Phantom Homicide.